This podcast is general admission, and this episode is dedicated to the Rock Against Racism rallies and carnivals that occurred in the late 70s and early 80s. I'm going to be playing some of the music from the lineups and talking through a bit of a history, at least of one small segment of the Rock Against Racism groups. Off the top, I should say, if you're a racist, then you just need to fuck off. Really. It's that simple. This particular episode will only deal with the London-based RAR shows, and up until the second carnival, which is 1978. The reason for that is there was over 200 Rock Against Racism chapters and at least 200 shows around the UK. So it would be far too hard to try and delve in with any depth or any comprehensiveness in a 1 hour sort of podcast. There will be future episodes when we get into other RARs around England and Scotland, particularly Leeds and Edinburgh. And of course, the American Rock Against Racisms, which occurred primarily in New York City in the 80s, and the ones that occurred in Canada in the 90s. And now, on to this month's story. April 30th was the 40th anniversary of the first Rock Against Racism Carnival, which was headlined by Tom Robinson Band in Victoria Park. Well, it's a month and a half late or so for the anniversary, as Donald Trump's racist populism and Doug Ford, the potato-like spud-wielding similar conservative populism to the premiership of Ontario last month, it seems like an appropriate time to celebrate the efforts of the Rock Against Racism group and the Anti-Nazi League as well to organize opposition to, at the time, the National Front. Now, the National Front is a particularly ugly, racist group, not unlike some of the racist groups that we're seeing today. This podcast will only spend as little amount of time covering the likes of The Clash, X-Ray Spex, Stiff Little Fingers, and Elvis Costello in favor of some of the lesser-known bands. But as I said off the top, the music will be political, even if it's not speaking that language directly. First, a little bit about Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League. Rock Against Racism started innocently enough with a letter to NME, the New Music Express, which was a British tabloid that specialized in music, about Eric Clapton's anti-immigrant rant at a live gig in Manchester in 1976, and his ostensible support of British Nazi Enoch Powell. Taking Clapton to task for his colonialist behavior, the letter expanded on the fact that Clapton's biggest hit was a cover of Bob Marley's I Shot the Sheriff, and his catalog, Clapton's catalog that is, included quite a few blues songs that were, not shockingly, written by African Americans. I mean, come on. You can't be racist on one hand, and oh, well, actually, no, you can. So the letter was written by Roger Huddle and Red Saunders, and a couple of other authors identified as cartoon clowns. Now, the cartoon clowns were not an individual per se, but a theater troupe that were doing some avant-garde and radical and kind of political things. They're kind of an interesting group. You should have a look for them on Google or your search engine of choice, and you'll find out lots of interesting things about what they were doing. Shortly after the letter was published, lots of people started writing to Red Saunders and Roger Huddle, who were using the Socialist Workers' Party mailbox. And so they were inundated with people who were interested in supporting and agreed with them. So, to that end, the first Rock Against Racism gig was Friday, December 10th, 1976, at the Royal College of Art, London, and it featured Carol Grimes and the London Boogie band, Matumbi, and Limousine. You're probably thinking I was going to say something like the Sex Pistols or the Clash. Well, wait for it. Both the Sex Pistols and the Clash, well, Johnny Rotten at least, and the Clash supported the sort of the anti-racist nature of the Rock Against Racism group. However, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next segment. So let's hear a bit from those bands first, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about who they were and what they did.
Here's your chance if you Yeah. Let the music play on, let it play on. Let it play on, yeah.
So at the top of that mini set was Carol Grimes' band with Give It Everything You've Got. Carol Grimes was primarily known as a jazz artist, but has also dabbled in funk and soul, in this case a bit of an up-tempo R&B number. That song was from the band's Peel session from July 4th, 1974, which was 2 years before this Rock Against Racism gig. Carol Grimes is a bit of a unknown player, and it's unfortunate because I think she was hamstrung by the time and place. So there was a period of time after this where Carol was still playing in this sort of R&B style, which I think would have been really well received in that sort of late 70s era. And she didn't release any records for about 5 or 6 years because in between about 1976 and 84, I think, she was held up in a contract disagreement with her record label. And her record label basically sat on her and didn't do anything with her recordings, didn't do anything to promote her, and essentially tried to kill her career. Nevertheless, Carol Grimes ended up going out and playing a lot with the London Boogie Band, which is a band that she assembled to play, you guessed it, boogie woogie kind of music. Really, it's R&B. And she also assembled, notably, the Carol Grimes Band, which appeared on the John Peel sessions. So, kind of interesting story there about a woman who's sort of, got fucked over by the record industry. After her, I played Matumbi with Blue Beat and Ska off their 1978 Harvest 12-inch of the same name, Blue Beat and Ska. Now, Matumbi is an interesting one as well because he's sort of playing, or they're, pardon me, playing in a lover's rock style of reggae where you're, slow dancing, trying to, take your date home for the evening, and the sort of sweet, soulful reggae that was coming out of the UK in the mid 70s. Harvest is the same label that put out the first couple of Wire records. And if you're trying to make sense of how Matumbi, a roots reggae kind of player, and Wire, pretty much the pinnacle of punk, post-punk bands, how they end up on the same label, well, indie labels in the late 70s and early 80s were much more diverse in their offerings than they are currently. Now, to the last band, Limousine were the last band. And try as I might, this is the first time I've never been able to sort of find any information about Limousine. Now, it doesn't help that they have a fairly common name. If you do a search for Limousine on Google, you're going to find lots of limousine companies. But I really couldn't find much about them, so it leads me to believe that perhaps they never recorded or released anything and were just a band that was playing out in live. If you have any information to the opposite, let me know, and I'd be happy to sort of put together a missed episode of things that I missed. Now, RAR were also busy during this early time in 1976-77 with their zine Temporary Hoarding. They released at least 3 issues at the time between the first official Rock Against Racism in 1976 and the 1978 Carnival that will really capture the attention of thousands of people throughout the UK. Temporary Hoarding is a zine that you should try to see. It's sort of has epitomized the fusion of design and politics at the time for me, and really is a great example of the two working together. Of course, trying to describe the design ethic of a fanzine in a podcast is just mind-blowingly stupid. So I'll add some images and links in the notes, and you can see it there. Another thing RAR was busy with was setting up satellite RARs. So if somebody sent in a letter of support, I talked about those earlier, they got a letter back encouraging them to be an RAR for the local town or city that they were from. That's how RAR leads started. That's how all the RARs actually started. So that's kind of an interesting thing, because in modern sort of organizing and trying to start a distributed group, you could easily have your opponents sign up to become an RAR and then say terrible things on your behalf. It should also be stated at this time that the National Front was gaining numbers of people out to vote for them in the by-elections and local elections. So there was some concern that the National Front could actually post a candidate that might actually win a seat in the Houses of Parliament. Another important thing that happened around 1977 is the Anti-Nazi League. Now, a lot of people think that the Anti-Nazi League preceded Rock Against Racism, but in fact, the Anti-Nazi League was a group that was formed and supported by the Socialist Workers' Party in conjunction with some of the trade unions. And its sole purpose was to combat the National Front and related racist groups. This was a bit of a polarizing group in anti-fascist work, certainly later, as the Anti-Nazi League was much more in bed with establishment groups like the Labour Party, whereas groups like Anti-Fascist Action, who rose up in the 80s, were much more grassroots and acknowledged the role of government in enabling and in some cases outright enhancing racism. However, in terms of RAR, the Anti-Nazi League was key in helping fundraise, advertise, and mobilize people in the late 70s. Certainly, they were one of the reasons that a lot of people were able to hear about these things in a pre-internet age. I mean, today we just go on the internet and search anti-racist, blah, 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 and you can find it. But back in the 70s, you'd have phone networks, mail-outs, those sorts of things. So you really relied on some organizations to help you leverage causes. The relationship was not one way, though. You can clearly see some of the Rock Against Racism style and design ethic applied to the Anti-Nazi League leaflets and posters. And certainly if you look at the buttons and the design style of both groups, they are on point. Rock Against Racism started out as a series of small gigs, but by 1978 it was clear that with punk on its ascent and maybe even at its peak, that change was afoot. That change was not only the type of things that rock and roll would sing about, but also who it was played by and with. This next set contains songs by the bands who played at the April 30th, 1978 Carnival in Victoria Park in London. The gig was headlined by Tom Robinson Band and featured an unannounced but rumored performance by The Clash. Now, a couple things about the Carnival before we get to the music. The Carnival, and it was purposefully written as a carnival, not a concert, not a protest, not a gathering, not a march, had not only a main stage, but a rather lengthy march that preceded it. In fact, the march took up several miles, and there was some concern by the organizers that they would never be able to get people to march from Leicester Square to Victoria Park. I think it's something like 7 or 8 miles. It's a significant walk. So what they did was they actually arranged to have bands playing on the back of a flatbed truck. They had lots of people with whistles. They made it a fun sort of Mardi Gras type event. Now, bands that play on a flatbed truck, leading people to a larger concert, this is what interests me. I'm way more interested in these bands. Let's face it, The Clash have had 50 or 60 books written about them on all sorts of aspects, perhaps because they're one of the greatest bands ever. The rest of those players were, and they're well enough known. I mean, I think we understand who X-Ray Spex are. I think we understand who some of those other players are, except for maybe Patrik Fitzgerald. So let's do a quick run through of the bands that played the main stage in this next set.
Dark head waiting in the middle of the road. Supercharged fizzes on the asphalt. The kids are coming in from the cold. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Panic in the county hall. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Whitehall, up against the wall, up against the wall. High-wire fencing on the playground. High-rise housing all around. High-rise prices in the high street. High time to put it all down. Boys kicking in a window. Straight girls watching where they go. Never trust a copper in a crime car. Just whose side are you on? Said, look out, listen, can you hear it? Panic in the county hall. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Whitehall, up against the wall, up against the wall, against the wall. Consternation in Mayfair, rioting in Notting Hill Gate, fascists marching on the high street, carving up the welfare state. Operator, get me the hotline. Said, Father, can you hear me at all? Telephone kiosk out of order, spray can writing on the wall. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Panic in the county hall. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Whitehall, up against the wall. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Panic in the county hall. Look out, listen, can you hear it? Whitehall, up against the wall. Up against the wall. Up against the wall.
best, man. It's ending.
Fuck, they're really pissed off.
Keep telling you, we love you. We are Irish. We are
Can't see the guy, you know? Fucking buried. Yishko! Pizda!
Listen to those people screaming at CPI shit. What those tits like?
Yeah.
I bet you Zwall's gonna go see Muffin and Muffins now. Either that or Teenage Head. You wanna try to slide into Teenage Head? I know how you can get in free to the Larry's.
Nah. There's a movie I want to check out on the video.
Yeah,
It's called The War of the Planets.
as soon as I get out of debt, man, I'm gonna fucking have to buy a TV for the winter, like.
Yeah, because when you're in the house a lot,
I know.
you gotta have that relief, you know?
Look at this, man. I still need some C90s though, you know?
Oh yeah? But I need the money, like.
No, I know, I mean, I still need some more tapes, like tape copies of things, you know, of other people. So I know it's gonna cost me a lot of money.
Show them, ja pick me know them, ja pick me point them out now, ja pick me let me wipe them out. Rock against racism, smash it. Rock against fascism, smash it. Rock against Nazism, Mr. Smash it. I've come to conclusion that we're gonna hunt. The National Front, yes we are. We're gonna hunt, the National Front, cause they believe in apartheid for that we gonna whoop their heights. For all my people that cheated and lied, hey, I won't rest till I'm satisfied. The National Front said we gonna hunt. The National Front said we gonna hunt. The National Front said we gonna hunt. The National Front want you to know we've got lots to show right here. It fights in black, red, green, or gold. Oh, it's just a gift from Jah Jah. Oh, so it's in black, it's proud to say it's your throat we're up. Dread must stop, 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 dread must stop. The National Front is there, national. Dread must stop, dread must stop, dread must stop, dread must stop. I suffer not from inferiority, a poverty-stricken, complex, I know. Cause it's black man time. There's no chip on my shoulder, no. It's all that talk that get I vex, yes, when I catch up on them. Wicked red jarro, got to get rough on got to get tough on had enough of that kind of stuff on from. It is black and white, dread that top rasta, original. Just pick me know them. Just pick
Just trick me, let me wipe them out. Rock against racism, smash it. Rock against fascism, smash it. Rock against Nazism, smash it. It was a tough decision. I found it. I've come to a conclusion. I've come to a conclusion. I've come to a conclusion that is rock against racism. Skadla boom, skadla ziba. Skadla doot, skadla ziba. Rock a room, rock a rhythm, rhythm. Skadla boom, skadla ziba. Rock against racism. Rock against racism. Me say all and all. 1, 2, 3, 4.
You're all too busy saving children in Chile and helping flood victims on the other side of the world. And when the war was over in Vietnam, you had 3 adopted boys and 5 adopted girls. Got to burst with food parcels when they're starving in Afghanistan, India, Kenya or anywhere really. I've seen some tram pass before the time on the street. You just said sorry, I'm fast, but not as fast as your feet. You're too busy fighting your irrelevant battles to see what's going on in your own backyard. Too busy fighting your irrelevant battles to see what's going on in your own backyard. Cause some of us are having a hard time. Yeah, some of us are having a hard time. And you're all too busy saving children in Chile and helping flood victims on the other side of the world. And when the war was over in Vietnam, you had 3 adopted boys and 5 adopted girls. You're out on the streets with your little placards, marching up and down saying tear it down. I don't think you've even seen what you're talking about, except for the tourist version, no doubt. You're too busy fighting your irrelevant battles to see what's going on in your own backyard. Too busy fighting your irrelevant battles to see what's going on in your own backyard. Cause some of us are having a hard time. You know that some of us are having a hard time. Because some of us are having a hard time.
So, in that set I played Tom Robinson Band, and I played Up Against the Wall. Tom Robinson Band headlined over The Clash, and at the time this might have made some sense, and in fact, clearly it did. Tom Robinson Band had songs in the charts, had just released an album. They were and quite popular in and of themselves. Although you can see from history's rearview mirror, then probably even a little bit at the time, who should have headlined the show. That shouldn't diminish Tom Robinson at all, though. His pub punk rock wasn't groundbreaking, but the personal politics were. Tom Robinson is gay, and was something that was kind of rare in the late 70s. To have a vociferously out frontman of a rock and roll band, it just wasn't done. Glad to Be Gay is probably their best known number, which certainly made an impression on Billy Bragg, whose attendance at this very gig made the political aspect of rock and roll front and center for him. So instead of playing Glad to Be Gay, I played Tom Robinson's best song off his first album, Up Against the Wall, which I thought was more appropriate considering the current times. The Clash I played next, and they played White Riot at the Carnival show, so with a guest appearance by Jimmy Percy. So I played White Riot from a bootleg of the band's 1979 show in Toronto at the Danforth or O'Keefe Center. I forget which one is which was their closer of that set. So there's a bit of tape thing going on the bootleg. That's okay, you'll live. I think there's a few funny footnotes about the whole Clash thing here. In the negotiations with Rock Against Racism for the Clash to appear, Bernie Rhodes, who was their manager at the time, tried to get Rock Against Racism to pay for a tank for the opponents of a racist regime in Zimbabwe in exchange for the Clash playing. I don't know how that negotiation went, That's just seems like an insane thing to do. Funny thing about this particular song, if you're old enough to have seen a TV show aired in Southern Ontario on City TV called The New Music, you might be familiar with it. If you're elsewhere, because John Roberts, who is a anchor at NBC News, I think, was J.D. Roberts in his previous life and did interview segments on The New Music. There's a clip, and I'll link to it in the show notes, of Cosmo Vinyl, the Clash's road manager, counting off the number of broken seats and proclaiming that to be the number of rock fans in Canada. That was from that show. So, another interesting thing about this show, David Widgery, who wrote a piece about the carnival in Radical America, which is a journal, an academic journal, and from the September 1978 issue, he wrote, "The Clash, though atrocious posers, Joe Strummer modeled a Red Brigade t-shirt, are still brilliant and very radical musicians." Of course, the Clash and Joe Strummer particularly were cautious to endorse the event without supporting the groups underneath it. So they were, very pro Rock Against Racism, but not necessarily interested in supporting the Socialist Workers' Party. And to sort of close the loop on this thing, Crass and Poison Girls called the entire lot white liberal shit, perhaps with some good reason. After the Clash, I played X-Ray Spex, and they opened the gig. And so I've always, wondered about how they might have felt playing to a fairly empty park and having, by the second song, the park start to fill up. That strikes me as something that would be at first demoralizing and then all of a sudden energizing and great. I haven't seen a lot of footage of the X-Ray Spex from this show, and it's a pity because I have seen a lot of The Clash and Tom Robinson Band and Steel Pulse. So it strikes me that perhaps whoever was recording it came along in the march. It's a pity because X-Ray Spex are the most interesting band playing the main stage, I think. Polystyrene, who was the singer of X-Ray Spex, played the 2008 follow-up to a Rock Against Racism called Love Music, Hate Racism. I played Identity off the John Peel sessions that were a bonus track on the Germ-Free Adolescence CD reissue on Castle from around 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. The Peel session was recorded March 6th, 1978, so just a few months prior to the carnival. Next, I played Steel Pulse. Steel Pulse were probably the second most important reggae band from the 80s, besides Bob Marley. I played Jaw Pick Me RAR, which appears on their second album, Into the Martyrs. This wasn't their first explicitly anti-racist song either. The killer track Ku Klux Klan exists on their debut LP, and that song actually made the UK charts, so it tells you a little bit something about how times are different. The one thing I really appreciate about Steel Pulse is that they were much more focused on working class lyrical content than praising Jah. So, and it strikes me as the UK reggae at this time were much more overtly political, with people like Linton Kwesi Johnson, Aswad, Misty and Roots, and Steel Pulse all making their mark in the late 70s, early 80s, and becoming really important for the UK reggae scene. Steel Pulse's uncompromising political stances always made me like them, and they made natural allies of the punks in the late 70s. By the 80s, they had cracked the US, and by 1990, they had a track of theirs in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, so you might know them from that. To get at how big Steel Pulse were, they had 3 songs hit the UK charts in 1978 and 1979, and another in the US in the 80s. All that, I think, is partially because of the exposure of the RAR gigs. Also playing the main stage, but getting very little notice, credit, attention, was Patrik Fitzgerald, who was doing folk punk before it was a thing. And his Wikipedia page says he's the inventor of folk punk. I'm sure there's something before that. I mean, if you want to get into it, you could probably say that, Woody Guthrie is probably the original folk punk, but we'll leave that debate to another day. I played the song Irrelevant Battles off of the Paranoid Ward EP, which is, I think, far better than the one that he released first, which is skipping my brain right at the moment. If you like the Violent Femmes, you're going to like this EP. It's in the same vein as the Violent Femmes' first album, and although it precedes it by a good 3 or 4 years at least. So hopefully this little ditty will get him some more notice, and people will be digging into his work his earlier and later work. One thing of note, if you're a fan of the Jam, who were signed to Polydor Records, Patrik Fitzgerald was also signed to Polydor and ended up opening for the Jam on one of their tours. So it's kind of trying to imagine that mix is kind of a head scratcher, but all right. Now, one of the most important things that RAR gigs ended with was a jam with all the artists. And this was a very, political statement imposed on by the organizers as a statement that black and white folks could work together. And to me, that's kind of an interesting thing, because a lot of the reggae musicians who were playing these RAR gigs were seasoned musicians. They could play. And I'm thinking about The Clash, who, Mick Jones can play, Joe Strummer can play, but they can play sort of in a narrow range, whereas I think the reggae dudes could probably play a lot more wider. So that would be an interesting sort of culture shock for both groups, I think. As I said before, the march was less of a staid chanting march, with racists must go, or, chants like that. And they were sort of organized more like a party. The RAR group were really trying to use a populist approach to confronting racism, appealing to the common sense idea that race isn't all that different. So let's play some music by some of the bands that were at the first carnival but didn't play the main stage, starting with the Members.
Well, you can't see the town, so that's a grow out.
figure out who played the march that preceded the carnival in Victoria Park was difficult. I can confirm that Misty and Roots did for sure. So, I do know the members played, and I played the members first. So, the members, really, if you've listened to them before, you'll know that they've alternated between punk and reggae numbers. At the Chelsea nightclub is an underrated classic, I think. Surely because I think it came out a year too late. I think if it was a year earlier, they would have been up there with the Damned and some of those other early punk bands that were quite great. Slaughter and the Dogs, I could totally see them being along with that. The Ruts, those sorts of bands. The song I played appeared on the Streets compilation. It was in fact the members' first release, and it was also Beggar's Banquet's first release. They really did a number on this one, you could say. Some excellent tracks on this comp. Really, really solid from start to finish, but the member song is heads and shoulders above many of the other tracks. Well, maybe it equaled by the Slaughter and the Dogs track. Anyways, the members would at this point in their careers be either on Stiff Records or just after they released their second Stiff single and just signed to Virgin. Either way, Fear on the Streets is a great song by the members. After that, I played Misty and Roots' Mankind off of the Live at the Counter Eurovision 79. Misty and Roots played the Procession in April, but by September they were on the main stage of the Carnival 2. We'll talk a little bit more about that when that time comes. At this point, Misty and Roots didn't have a real release out. Their debut LP came out in 79. They had some singles out, but nothing full length. So they wouldn't have been super well known. Along with Aswad and Steel Pulse, Misty and Roots played more RAR events than any other band. And so Misty and Roots were kind of the house band for Rock Against Racism. Now, they also have a reason to. In 1979, Clarence Baker, a member of the Misty Collective, he was severely beaten and injured during a protest against the National Front in Southall. So, of course, Rock Against Racism gathered together and did a benefit for him. So it's important to sort of note that not only were the reggae bands playing these events to raise awareness, but they were actually marching, protesting, and getting involved in the sort of the way that they could sort of express themselves in late 70s UK. Another interesting thing, and this is a parallel that is often overlooked, especially by punk historians, is that reggae also has a strong DIY sort of component, especially in the late 70s and early 80s. That sort of punk dialogue between punk and reggae is that, you know, other marginalized music learned that, well, the punks are putting out their own records. It can't be that hard. We better do that too. You can control your own music and cut out the major label businesses from a portion of your work. Misty and Roots were far more DIY than our contemporaries and set up the People's Unite label to release their own music and still do to this day. Now let's move on to Carnival 2.
I would send out for assistance, but there's someone on the signal wire, and the corporation logo is flashing on and up in the sky. They're putting all your names in the forbidden book. I know what they're doing, but I don't want to look. You think they're so
think they're so dumb. You think they're so funny. Wait until they got you running to the night rally, 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 night rally,
Why standeth in the shadows and bow your head? Life is for living, it's not for the dead, my friend. This situation, them hunting for solution. Let all odds be as one, and then they won't ask to cry. Can't stand the pressure. Can't bear the pain. Can't stand the pressure. Can't bear the pain. Don't fret not, my brother. Try forbid the sisters to cry. No, say I and I, we shall bear fruit again. But while pockets empty, many things I shall be denied. Then you take what you get. Now your shame make you hide. Can't stand the pressure. Can't bear the pain. 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 Why standeth in the shadows, muted by your pride? Art thou not man as well? Then why cast yourself aside? Got to stand strong, yet equal not with their vanity. No, say I, brethren, the truth, the I have been known. Can't stand the pressure. Can't bear the pain. Can't stand the pressure.
The one there lose control here.
This one called How long do we have to suffer? How long must we feel the pain? How long?
Everybody's down in the center of town. We're doing nothing wrong, we're only hanging around. And they put you up against the wall. Make loud my jokes just to make you feel small. Laugh at your appearance and the clothes you wear. Call that justice just isn't fair. I'm talking about the law and order. They don't know what they are. Law and order. There's no justice in it. None. I had a friend who was living by the law. Lifted and shifted and dumped on the floor. They treated him like shit. Kicked him in the head and then left when he fled. Spat in his face and pulled his hair. All that justice just isn't fair. I'm talking about the law and order. They don't know what they are. Law and order. There's no justice in it. None. I'm not trying to say we're always right. No one's saying that it's black and white. All I'm saying is we don't agree. I don't think like you don't think like me. I'll get everything. And that's the way to try and run this land. How they hold you down and keep you in hand. You're just a pawn in that game. You're just another know that you ain't got a name. You're just a little punk, you know, they don't care. All that justice just isn't fair. I'm talking about the law and order. They don't know what they are. Law and order. There's no justice, isn't law and order. They don't know what they are. Law and order. There's no justice, isn't law and order. They don't know what they are. Law and order. There's no justice, isn't none. Justice all gone. It's all gone.
Know by now. I played Night Rally off the first album, Elvis, Costello and the Attractions, this year's Model, which came out in 1978. Night Rally is a fairly topical number, let's say. After that, I played Aswad, who are still playing periodically today, but didn't really hit their commercial success until the late 80s. Their album Distant Thunder hit the UK Top 10 in 1988, that's the album charts, and their song Don't Turn Around went to number 1 in the UK and New Zealand, and top 10 in 4 other European countries. They became incredibly popular later on in their career, but, well, incredibly popular for a reggae band. It's unheard of, practically, for reggae bands to chart on multiple charts and get to number 1 with a song. But in 1978, they weren't as well known. I played Can't Stand the Pressure off their self-titled release. After that, I played Misty and Roots again, Ghetto on the City. Again, great song, great band. It just shows you how quickly things were moving in 1978 when a band who in April played the Procession, essentially an opener, ends up on the main stage. After them, I played Stiff Little Fingers. If you aren't aware of who Stiff Little Fingers are, you should probably get on your local search engine and look them up. They're pretty good. I played Law and Order off of Inflammable Material, and yeah, they're great. Lastly, I played Sham 69, and you may be going, if you're familiar with the carnivals and what happened in 1978 with Rock Against Racism, you'll go, hang on, Sham 69 didn't play. And that's true. That's absolutely factually correct. They didn't play because there was so many death threats against them that the record company and Rock Against Racism couldn't raise the insurance to actually make sure that if Jimmy Percy would die, somebody would get paid. So they instead just told them not to show up and not to play. That didn't really stop Jimmy Percy. In the process, he gave a very passionate speech supporting the anti-racist cause. Now, Jimmy Percy being the singer of Sham 69 and having this problem, the band, in fact, having this problem with National Front Nazis coming and showing up and ruining their gigs, really eventually led to the demise of the band, which it was clearly premature, and it would have been interesting to see what the band would have done, where they would have gone. Would they have become much more successful if it were not for this sort of Nazi interference? One thing that I find curious, and maybe somebody out there will correct me because it's the internet and that's how things work, with all the writing that's been done about Rock Against Racism and the first carnival, which really got a lot of press, got a lot of respect, got a lot of notoriety in not only the music tabloids, but also books and throughout biographies of the bands, the second one gets a mere passing glance. Yes, there was a massive march. Yes, there was a great rally. Yes, there was an incredible concert featuring some of the era's greatest bands. Well, greatest bands in the UK anyways. But there's not a lot of writing about it. It strikes me as a bit odd. Considering that the organizers were the same, it was a mere few months apart. I suspect it's all because nobody remembers the second person to do something amazing. And the first concert was admittedly amazing and had some really memorable stories tied to it. Of course, I'm just shooting from the hip here. I don't know. If I've gotten it wrong and you were there and you want to correct me, by all means get in touch and set me straight. Be happy to hear about it. Happy to talk about this topic more because I think anti-racist music is really important. So, for this month, I'm John Krutoff, and this has been General Admission. For today's playlist and more stuff I'm writing, please visit General Admission blog on Medium at medium.com/general-admission. If you want to interact on Twitter, it's GENADM show. If you're old, and email, and I can do that too. General Admission Show, all lowercase, all one word, at gmail.com. If you didn't like the podcast, in the words of the immortal Big Boys, go make your own podcast.